Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello. Welcome to this solo episode. I am so excited that you're here. I'm grateful that you've decided to listen to this podcast. And if this is your first episode, welcome. If this is not your first episode, then welcome back. And you probably know that most of the episodes that I have for this podcast are conversations. And so this is a bit of a change of pace for me. I'm currently speaking to you from the comfort of the office space I have in my apartment, located in the ancestral land of the Lenape people, also called Brooklyn, New York. And I'm looking outside my window. It is nice and bright out there, but also really cold. This is the end of March. The weather is really weird. And I'm excited to be sharing with you a little bit about how I created this podcast. And the reason why I decided to record this episode are because I really love it when other people share their process. I sometimes wonder, as a musician, if maybe I create music so I can share the behind the scenes. I always find the process itself so endlessly fascinating, maybe more so than the finished product. So selfishly, I want to create this because I want to leave something for my future self to listen to in case I forget some of the lessons that I learned. One of the things that I have been noticing as a theme that comes up in conversations with friends, with people who come to me for readings, is this idea that our younger selves actually carry so much wisdom with them, and that we don't always take the time to really sit down and process and digest all the wisdom that they have to share with us, because we have been conditioned and we have been taught to value progress over reflection, right? Value progress over digestion. And so while I have many other exciting conversations in the future that I want to be sharing with you with brilliant members of my community, I want to take this time to allow myself to slow down and to share a little bit about my story with creating this podcast, and also some of the lessons that I learned. And the other reason why I want to share this is I have a feeling that some of you listening may also have it somewhere in you to be creating a podcast. And if that's you, then this episode will be directly relevant to you, hopefully. I mean, I know that all of us have different journeys, but you might find this useful. And if you are not interested in creating your own podcast, then I think some of the lessons that I learned about creativity, about myself, about my own process will also hopefully inspire you to be reflecting on your own process too. Okay, so the first thing that I want to share is something that I learned, which is that our creativity, our creative forces, our creative spirit are always moving through us. Our thinking minds, our egos, have been trained to consider that perhaps creativity looks a certain way. Maybe it looks like posting every day on Instagram, or maybe it looks like releasing your art every month, or releasing podcast episodes every week, or anything like that. But I have learned that periods of gestation, periods of being pregnant with your creative projects, periods of not yet launching or sharing, periods of maybe experimenting with different techniques or different creations that ultimately you will not share, all of that is so integral to the creative process, and that the creative process is really a cycle, right? It's really it works in phases, and so the question isn't so much about whether you are being creative or not, because for me, I had to work with a lot of judgments that come up around, am I still a creative person if I'm not releasing something out into the world? And what I've learned is that you are never not creative. And I think this applies to all of us universally. Everyone is endowed with inherent creativity, and that you're always creating something. The real question is not whether you're creative or not. The real question is, what stage are you currently moving through within this creative process? Are you currently in your research process, maybe trying out different ideas, feeling into which one is really calling you? Are you perhaps allowing yourself to be playing the role, maybe temporarily, of the people who will ultimately be enjoying your creations? And maybe you are going to other creators or working with their output in some ways that will help you figure out what it is that you want to be doing, how it is that you want to be doing it, right? And the next question that feels really important is, how can you allow yourself to be nurtured, to feel resourced within this particular stage? Because each stage in your creative process has its own unique challenges. And so with those challenges, it is important to be thinking about what resources you need. Maybe you need a space holder. Maybe you need to hire someone, right? And so if you honor all of the different stages, all of the different phases of the creative cycle, then I think we can have a lot of compassion with ourselves and start to move away from this idea that we are not creative, which I think is just not true. All of 2020 and 2021, I thought that I was primarily creating my next music album. I worked really hard at finishing the songs. I created this gorgeous visual deck. I worked my ass off to get my voice to the point where I can actually sing the songs that I wrote. And for one reason or another, that project is just not what wants to be shared with the world. And it's really interesting because I still don't quite know why that is. But what I do know now is that this podcast was actually the project that wanted to come forward and wanted to be shared with the world. Throughout 2020 and 2021, I was taking a lot of astrology, tarot, energy healing classes. I was in a lot of different communities, and looking back, I realized that all of those classes, including the weekly voice lessons that I took, all of the people that I've met across various virtual learning communities, all of the relationships that I've nurtured with different mentors, different peers, and even with different students throughout the pandemic, they've all kind of led me towards the creation of this podcast. And so it was really valuable to realize that, because one perspective is that I had failed in creating my music album, right? I had worked on it for a while and it hasn't really come to fruition yet. But another perspective is that it's simply not the creative project that wants to be birthed. And with the perspective that I have now after releasing this podcast, I can see how that is. And a little bit about how I created this podcast, because there's also I think a pretty interesting story behind it. The idea for this podcast really came to me at the beginning of 2021. I believe maybe it was late January or early February that I started writing on my journal that I wanted to create a podcast. And so I kind of sat with it for a while. I let it simmer. And in May 2021, I had a call with my mentor, Sabrina Monarch. I was in her astrological learning container called Meteorite. And in Meteorite, part of the program was to come up with our own personal project to show ourselves and others in the container by the end of that program. And as the Gemini moon that I am, I had a bunch of different ideas. I think I shared maybe 10 or 12 ideas with Sabrina. And the idea that really jumped out was creating a podcast. And Sabrina was immediately excited by the idea of creating a podcast. And seeing her reaction made me realize that, yes, I do want to create this podcast. And so we were talking about the different names that we could potentially attach to the podcast, right? Or allow the podcast to exist under this particular umbrella of a concept. And the name Future Language came through, and we were immediately excited by that name. So you may have heard me talk about Future Language with some of my guests that I've had in the previous episodes. And in late December 2021, I found another podcast with the same name. And it's interesting because if you know the podcasting world, then you will know that a lot of people seem to share similar names for their podcasts. If you look up very famous catchphrases in the spiritual community, spiritual realm, things like align, things like self-love, things like resonance, right? Words, keywords like that, you will see that a bunch of podcast names will pop up, and a lot of them have very similar names. And so I don't think that this is a problem per se. If you are a podcast expert and you want to correct me, feel free to let me know. But there was a discomfort that was a little bit deeper for me that came up with realizing that, oh, actually there's another podcast with this name. And so I kind of had to sit with that. And I kind of had to sit with why it was that the discomfort came up. Because what I have learned at that point was that when something like that comes up, right, it may not be that the act itself is not in alignment, but that perhaps there's something there for me to see about my process, or even maybe about this name, Future Language. So what I did was I asked my Akashic Records. Some of you may be wondering, what are the Akashic Records? I kind of think of it as this funnel through which my most potent, most loving guides, teachers, ancestors in the spiritual realm speak to me. The experience of connecting with your records can have this experience of deep trust and deep love, but also some of the insights that they share can be pretty destabilizing, not in a bad way, but just kind of maybe in an oh snap kind of way, because I kind of think of accessing my records as getting spiritual chiropractors to realign me back to where I currently am in my path. And I think that's also the experience of a lot of people who work with the Akashic Records. So what I asked them was, what's up with this feeling that I have around Future Language? And what they told me was that Future Language is the name of season 1 of the podcast, but not the name of the podcast itself. So I was like, okay, then what should be the name of this podcast? And what I heard was Healing the Spirit. And I was like, what? I really did not like that name. I think I mentioned this in the first episode. I really worried, at least my human self, that this is a presumptuous title. And a lot of questions come up like, who am I to be carrying a name like Healing the Spirit? Am I even a healer? What even is healing? And what is spirit? And I think looking back, this is precisely why that name came up for me. because working through these questions, right? And really valuing the process of questioning rather than thinking that we need to know all the answers is the journey that I'm on, you know? And for me, a huge part of my journey has been in healing the idea that I even know what healing is. I think a lot of us have ideas about what healing looks like or can look like or should look like that is counterproductive to the process of healing itself. And meanwhile, the idea of spirit is a felt and a very undeniable part of my experience in this universe. And yet I have found it to be impossible to define. And in a way, I guess that's what makes it exciting. In hindsight, future language was such an important concept because it carried enough electricity for me to make a move. Future language felt like it really tickled, it really awakened this Aquarius energy within me. And what's really cool about that idea of the future language was when I shared it with a lot of my friends, mostly astrologers, they also got really excited by that idea. And so it was, in a way, cool enough for me to see their reaction, to allow their reaction to kind of carry me forward and record a few of these first episodes that have a certain energetic imprint to them. Like it was this upstart energy, you know? And ultimately, I think future language was not fully resonant in the long run because it does carry this very conceptual, cool energy to it. But I think for me personally, it may not be carrying, you know, the energetics of the heart of what it is that I'm really interested in learning about over the long run. And so I asked a few friends whether they liked healing the spirit or whether they liked future language more, and the answer was really split in the middle. So I had to sit back and I had to feel into how their responses made me feel. And ultimately I chose healing the spirit because it was resonant, and my resistance around that name slowly dissipated, and it became this beautiful kind of cozy fleece jacket is how I like to think about it. It becomes this nice supportive blanket or umbrella under which I can create, as you know, the theme music, and it feels like, yeah, it just feels like a really nice theme for a series of conversations. And yeah, I think I also want to mention that composing the music was really interesting because they weren't composed specifically for the purpose of this project. And yet, I just knew when I received that name, Healing the Spirit, and I had some time to think about it, I had some time to sit with it, I realized that these two pieces of music, among many pieces of music that I've written in my life, has felt very, very resonant, and they felt really close to my essence. And so it feels nice to have something that reflects kind of, you know, a very essential part of me. Another thing that I want to share is around my voice and my accent. And this has been such a huge part of my work in the past few years, and I find it really funny how people have come up to me and say, I really love hearing your voice on the podcast. And this is just completely unfathomable to me. especially when I think about myself a few years ago, because I have always had this fear that I will sound unintelligent because English is my second language. And I can't even place my own accent. I don't know why I sound the way I sound, and I don't necessarily know people who sound like me either. So, a huge moment of healing, of reckoning, I suppose, came when I was watching, I think this was during 2020. I was watching this show called Next in Fashion with Tan France and Alexa Chung. And if you know Tan France from Queer Eye, Tan is a fabulous queer person who also had this really strange accent. Like, when I hear Tan speak, I have no idea where this person came from. It sounds like this person is collecting a bunch of different accents together and then kind of creating their own unique way of speaking English. And it hadn't dawned on me up until that moment of watching Tan France on Next in Fashion that could be something interesting, because I personally was very drawn to what Tan had to say about a lot of different things. And so that was a big moment of permissioning for me. And I know that this is, my second example is maybe a little bit wild and a little bit crazy, but I have to make sure I get her name right. It's Catherine O'Hara, right? Catherine O'Hara. Yes. So when I was watching Schitt's Creek, Moira, which is played by the Canadian actress Catherine O'Hara, had a very weird accent. Like, she was just kind of, it was all over the place. If you had watched that show, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you had not watched that show, then I hope you do, because it's a great show. But Moira, Catherine's character, spoke in this very strange accent, like this mix of American accent plus British accent. I don't know what it is, but it was very interesting and very unique. And I think what I had to learn and what I had to witness was that actually we all have our own unique way of speaking, That moment made me realize that even if, somebody had what we may consider as the straight up or the most bland American accent, I don't even know if such a thing exists. I feel like I've lived in the US now for 15 years, and everyone I talk to sounds really different than other people, or they have their own unique way of speaking. But really allowing myself to at least appreciate my own way of communicating ideas has been a huge part of my journey. And, like many of us, I also had to struggle where I feel like I projected a lot of my self-hatred, for lack of a better term, towards my physical voice. And I was Googling this. I was like, why do people hate the sound of their own voice? Apparently, there's a physiological reason to it, because when we are speaking, the resonance of our voice essentially vibrates other parts of our body. So we hear more resonance when we are speaking than what actually comes out. So, yes. So anyways, if you've been wondering why a lot of people hate the sound of their own voice on a recording, that's apparently why. You can Google this. What I will say about that is that many, many teachers have helped me across, the past few years with working through this. On a physical level, my voice teacher, Jamie Lenhart, really guided me through a deeper understanding of my own voice. We have weekly voice lessons, and although the lessons mostly revolve around using my voice in the context of singing and making musical noises, ultimately, it really helped me understand that my voice isn't isolated from the rest of my body. It's been a process for about 3 years now to gently tend to my whole being, including the feelings that come up around my voice, and finding ways to use my voice that feels the most easeful and the most authentic to me. And Jamie's patience, Jamie's care has been so instrumental in me embracing my own physical voice. On an energetic level, my energy healing teacher, Deborah Kremens, also has really helped me tremendously by guiding us through some past lives work, specifically in locating and working with energetic imprints that we carry from past lives that are still holding us back now. Through this work, I discovered multiple lifetimes of being ostracized, being hurt, or even being killed for sharing my voice and my gifts. Now, I know that this framework around past lives may not fully resonate with everyone, but for me, this was really huge in helping me clear away some of the energetic junk that was preventing me from sharing my voice and from sharing my perspective. There was a lot of fear that felt very irrational for me with regards to sharing my voice. And somehow working with this on an energetic level has just been absolutely incredible and has really helped me move forward, like I would say really jump different timelines, or jump from one timeline to another. And yeah, I think having the support of a trusted guide, a trusted teacher also really helped. On a practical level, my astrology teacher, friend, and collaborator, Britton LaRue, also helped me a lot by inviting me to do webinars, to do Instagram lives, to do podcast conversations, to facilitate different learning containers with her, because I think that sharing your voice is one of those things that require a lot of practice, and the more you practice, the more ease that you will find. One thing that I learned that feels really relevant to share here is that as I practice putting myself out there, sharing my thoughts in a way that, of course, is compassionate and responsible to other people, I learn to see the reflection of how my thoughts and my ideas can help others. And that was such an important thing because it helped me see that speaking up and sharing my voice isn't just for me. It's also part of how I share my service to the world. Finally, many friends encourage me in small and big ways, including and probably especially all of the guests in season 1 who said yes to the invitation of this podcast before I even really knew the final name of this podcast or how to create a podcast. So the reason why I'm sharing all of this with you is to kind of debunk the idea that some of these things that are keeping you back, right, that you want to overcome or you want to heal, the healing process doesn't have to be done alone. For me, learning how to come to a place of deeper peace and acceptance of my own voice really took a whole village. And there's no shame in enlisting support from other people, from teachers and guides and mentors that you can really appreciate and whose perspectives resonate with you. It's not shameful to ask friends to help you with this. I also accept that the fear of using my voice, of being heard, of sharing my perspectives is probably never going to go away. I think that this is something that is a constant work in progress. Full disclosure, recording this episode, for example, without the help of, having a guest and having that flow of the conversation is certainly a growth edge for me. And yet, I think that we can come to a place where the fear is no longer stopping us from truly sharing our gifts, right? Maybe the whole point is not to feel like you don't have this issue anymore, but really that you can have compassion for yourself for feeling scared of sharing your voice, and to allow yourself to feel scared, allow yourself to feel a little bit panicked about sharing your voice. And all of that is such an integral part of the whole creative process. So one thing that I haven't seen in a lot of conversations about sharing our creative output out there and about being a creative person is how important the role of the nervous system is. When we think about our creative output, we are pouring love, pouring creativity, pouring our passion into a project that we will then put out publicly, where other people's response and what other people do with that output is not really something that we can control, right? And so it does take an effort to kind of create the nervous system capacity to be receiving the feedback from that creative output. And I think what can stop a lot of us from actually putting our creative projects out there is this experience of the nervous system fry, right? Like when you put a part of you out there that you then can't really fully control, it can feel like a threat to your nervous system. And so I feel like it's important for us to start acknowledging this and to start thinking about how can we resource ourselves to feel like we're not kind of splayed open when we're sharing our creative output out there, whether that's an Instagram post or whether that's a podcast episode or whether that's your art, right? Or your music or your writing or whatever, really. I think the first step is in acknowledging how that or energetic work needs to go into that work, right? Of putting yourself out there. In general, podcasting is a lot of work. If I knew how much work it would be to be this one-person operation, doing all of the things that I want to make sure I give, like creating episodes with decent audio quality, although we were recording everything on Zoom, like wanting to do some editing to make sure that the conversations are as engaging to listen to for the listeners, like creating introductions and show notes that are not only decent, but also fully celebrates the guests that I have and their wisdom and their presence. It's a lot of work. And don't get me wrong, I love doing the work. As a Virgo rising, doing meticulous work is part of how I express myself, part of how I share my true essence and how I express my love in the world. But as intuitives, as creatives, as beings who are connected to and sensitive to the subtle realm of energy, I think we need to acknowledge that sharing our projects can be a lot energetically. And so really remembering that we have the agency to take the steps necessary to ensure that we don't get to that point where our nervous system is fried is really important. I remember one weekend after I released the first batch of episodes, of conversations that I had edited, that I had written the show notes for, I literally could not get out of bed because my whole body is so tired. And so if there's one advice that I would give my younger self is that I had a choice, right? and I'm not saying that we don't need to take the time we need to take to get over hesitations, to get over our doubts. But you always have a choice to either spend your energy, spend your time doubting about whether you should be creating this thing, or you can spend your time slowly building and creating this thing, right? For me, I started recording some of these conversations in September. And so looking back, again, this is not a should. This is not I could have done this better kind of conversation, right? But just noticing that, oh yeah, actually I had the option to be editing my podcast episodes, maybe little by little, one conversation at a time, and even maybe allow the conversations to nourish me and in private, right, when I was just editing it by myself, and to really see how I'm going to be bringing something that's of value to other people by releasing this podcast. I could put my energy into worrying whether people will hate it or people will love it, or even worse, if people will ignore it altogether. Or I could use this energy to nourish and to care for my nervous system so that I am primed for when this creative project is live. I learned that creation is a two-way street, right? It's not just you generating your creations and the act of creating them also have this regenerative power for you. So allowing yourself to step out of your way so that your creative projects can be birthed through you can be very liberating. Finally, it also feels really important to me to talk about the schedule of this podcast. One thing that I was very clear about from the very beginning was how much I wanted this podcast to be nonlinear. I used to feel that without strict schedules, without strict timelines, I won't be able to create. But what I have found over the years is that not only is that untrue, but I've begun to see how there can be this lack of trust in that kind of thinking. There is a lack of trust in the potent intelligence that our creative forces move subconsciously or even unconsciously through all of us, right? And what if having those schedules actually stifle our creativity? One thing I hear a lot from folks that I work with on a one-on-one capacity, or that I hear from a lot of creator friends, is how people chastise themselves for not being consistent. If this is you, I really want to encourage you to challenge that voice. Because why do you believe that consistency is the only way to create? Why do you believe that consistency is the only way to birth your ideas and to ultimately feel however it is that you want to feel, right? Whether that's happy or creative, or like your creative forces are feeding you. It's helped me a lot to redirect this desire for discipline that I used to put into, creating crazy schedules, right? Or creating these really strict timelines, into having the discipline to reframe that what I perceive as inconsistency and resistance are potentially superpowers that I just haven't figured out how to tap into yet. A lot of the times when I experience myself to be inconsistent, or I feel some level of resistance, it's usually because my intuition is trying to tell me that there's something I am refusing to see. And so allowing myself to kind of take the time to, rather than continue to push on and to almost beat myself up for not living up to that schedule, what if I allow myself to have the time to really see what wants to come forward for me? So yes, this podcast will be seasonal, and it will follow the flow of the creative forces that are moving through me. You may see a lot of episodes being released at the same time if I'm having a bunch of different conversations. You may have no episodes for a while. If you follow me on Instagram, if you're on my newsletter, I will also most likely be very nonlinear in how I share about these conversations. Most likely you wouldn't find me talking about the conversation at the same time that I'm, releasing them. Because I fully trust that whoever needs the precise medicine that I'm sharing in these conversations, that my guests are sharing in these conversations, they'll find their own unique way to it in their own timing. Personally, as someone who consumes a lot of podcasts, I find that I would tune into conversations released years ago, And so obviously there's a part of me that, is conditioned for urgency, for desiring consistency above all else, for upholding these capitalist ideas of productivity, and this part of me is really freaking out, right? At the same time, I can see that there's another perspective where we can understand and embrace rest, nonlinearity as part of our innate truth, our deep longing, and our very, very wise design. All right, so I think that is all I will share about the making of this podcast so far. I hope that you found something useful in the share. I hope that something will inspire you to take that resonant action. And maybe that resonant action is resting, or maybe giving yourself spaciousness to tend to your creative projects and your own unique creative forces. If you are someone who's been thinking about making a podcast, again, I hope this is directly relevant to you and that it's useful in some ways. I would really love to hear from you. If you found this podcast inspiring or helpful in some ways, I would love it if you could share a kind reflection, whether that's in the form of a review or a 5-star rating on your podcast app. I would also love to read your feedback. If you feel like it's not for public consumption, you can email me on healingthespiritpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can also find me on Instagram at Nate Chi, that's NATE_QI, and you can share your thoughts with me. My sense is that if you are listening to this, you are someone who is highly creative and you're highly excited about the idea of creating waves of change, right? In how we live, how we think, how we care as a collective. And so if you feel called, I would love for you to consider sharing this episode, whether that's on your socials or privately with a friend or within your community. And I challenge you to actually share your thoughts in response to what I'm sharing here, because, including what doesn't resonate, if that's the case. Because my intention in creating these episodes is not just to amplify the thoughts that I have, because I think that the thoughts are interesting. As much as I believe them to be useful, I want to really begin inviting more people into a conversation around how we can reclaim our energy, our life force, our creativity, whatever term that feels resonant to you. For me, personally, sharing my thoughts kind of in response to other people's work and other people's thoughts has felt way more easeful than sharing thoughts out of nothing, out of the void, right? Which is also probably why I have a whole podcast that's centered around conversations. So if that resonates with you and if you feel called, I invite you to do so. And if you want, you can always tag me if that feels right. Okay, until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself, and I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.